The first thing I thought when trying to discuss or trying to figure out what subject I was going to go over was whether or not I wanted to do an installation or not. And I thought it'd be better to start from kind of an overhead view from the high level, kind of abstract things out a little bit. And that's why I decided to go with this subject matter, because oftentimes I see that just the way that our services and components talk to each other and what they're doing out there and what the roles of each component are tends to become confusing sometimes, especially when you jump right in. So I thought it'd be a good way to start would just be to get our heads around how all these components are talking to each other, what their roles are, and then in a future quick take we'll go through installation and some other specific subjects. But for now we're just going to talk about how all these different components relate to one another. So a bit about me. My name is Roy Martinez. I'm the lead MetaLogic support representative for SharePoint Backup. I have several years of experience working with the SharePoint Backup tool since its original inception, and that has given me the opportunity to watch this tool's feature set grow in response to customer demand and the way the underlying technology has advanced since the 1.0 release. So I've pretty much seen it all with SharePoint Backup, and I'm hoping to be able to share that expertise in the coming months and years with MetaLogic as the tool grows. Backup architecture from the top down looks kind of like this. So we've got a few key pieces, and this is how they relate to each other. So what we start with here is obviously the management console is this this aspect here, and this is basically the user interface, right? So this is the graphical interface that the end user relates to the tool through, and that talks then to our management service, and I'll go into more detail on each of these as we go along, but console talks to the management service. Management service is responsible for basically acting as the traffic cop between the end user and the underlying backup infrastructure, and he's going to store information into a repository database. And then out there in the field on each of your SharePoint servers, WFE and otherwise, are the backup services, and these backup services are responsible for the actual grunt work for the operations that we initiate via our console. So you can see a pretty straightforward workflow here. Operations are initiated from the console, those instructions are sent to the management service, stored into the repository, and then handed off to the backup services, which delegate those operations amongst themselves. And we'll get into that a little bit in more detail as we go. It was, it was a bit of a question as to what order I should go in when going through these components. I think I found the best order to go through in terms of, totality. So I'm going to start with the console and then end with the backup services, and I think that'll be the best way to view all this. So the management console is, again, it's a user interface and application that deploys to any Windows operating system up to 2012 R2, I think. We can manage single or multiple farms from this console, and that obviously depends upon management service and repository database requirements, and we'll talk a little bit more about those requirements as we move on. But suffice it to say, you can manage backup and restore operations for any number of farms within one single management console. You can also have multiple users leveraging different consoles basically attached to the same core installation. In other words, we can have several workstations, each of which hosts a console, with different users accessing and working with backup and restore operations pertaining to their particular areas of control. In other words, if we have one user who manages site collections A through D, and then another guy maybe does stuff on another web app and so on and so forth, each of these users can have a console on their own individual workstations wherein they manage their particular area of control there. And then each console reads metadata from the repository database to be shown in the graphical UI. And those metadata that I'm referring to are backup operation details like timestamps for the backups and restores, the backup type, whether full or differential, for instance, the duration, obviously, and then also configuration details such as scheduled backups that we have scheduled out there, grooming details, information that's been alerted upon per backup or operation status. And so yeah, and it's important to recognize these as metadata concepts, because when we get to repositories, you'll see there's a little bit of a differentiation there. So Moving along to the repository. So here's where we actually store all of our configuration information, backup and restore operation data, statistical and management service collected data. And what's meant by that in detail here is we've got backup service host names, for instance, information about the farm topology. We've got service orders for those backup services, and I'll talk about that a little bit more detail in the backup services section. Information regarding scheduled backups, obviously. This is all the stuff that's shown in human readable format in the UI, but obviously we can get to that same information from the tables if need be. Each management service is attached to and uses a specific and unique database repository. So in other words, for every installation that we do of SharePoint Backup, every unique installation handles and manages one specific farm, and every unique installation has its own management service and repository database. So those databases obviously can all be hosted on a single SQL Server instance. Obviously, the management service is a Windows service, so it would require separate machines. Usually, the way we see it is maybe there's an application server in the farm that hosts that management server for that particular installation, and we can talk about that in another quick take when we get to installation scenarios. Otherwise, the other thing to mention here is the repository does not store backed up content. So the backup sets that we create with SharePoint Backup, they actually get stored to the file system at a UNC share designated by the administrator or user of SharePoint Backup. So we only store metadata about said backup sets. So we have information about the backups, i.e., like we mentioned, timestamp information, duration, backup type, and the like. But the actual backup sets themselves exist on the file system. And that's what I mentioned earlier about the difference between the metadata we store in the repository versus actual backup set content, right? So moving along, the next player is the management service, and he's kind of, in a sense, the traffic cop of this architecture. He obviously receives instructions from the console, operation request specifically, and then he hands that off to the primary backup service, and we'll talk more about primary backup service momentarily, to initiate those operations, right? Obviously, he runs on any workstation we put him on, and he must be running in order to execute jobs. So by jobs, we mean our grooming mechanism, scheduled backup kickoffs, things of that nature. The management service is kind of the main entry point to getting operations to initiate. Although the work is actually done from the backup service end, this is where the work is initiated. So his most important role, aside from initiating those operations, is to record data into our repository database. And this is backup restore operation statuses received from the backup services out there in the field. Information about the schedules, he records that. Alerting, grooming configurations, so on and so forth. The other thing that isn't mentioned here that I should go ahead and note is that our grooming mechanism, in other words, our archiving and retention, is managed by our management service. So this guy does quite a bit of work. He's basically our file keeper, our traffic cop. So that's the management service, and he is uniquely and specifically tied to that repository database. They don't have to be on the same machine, but they are definitely working together in tandem at all times. Console reads from that repository once the management service has written to it. The backup services. So there's a lot to be said about the backup services. They're doing a lot of work. Like I mentioned before, these guys are installed out to each of the servers in your SharePoint farm. In the current release of the product, there's a differentiation between what's regarded as farm backup or component backup and granular backup, wherein farm backup is backing up, content database, registry hive, the SharePoint root, large component concepts like that. Whereas granular backups are backing up sites and site collections and allowing restore of individual objects from the content set. And the reason I mention that now in this quick take is that the backup service's role can change depending on the scope of the operation submitted. So from the perspective of farm backup, we're utilizing Microsoft Volume Shadow Copy Service to do those backups, whereas on the granular side, we leverage SharePoint APIs exclusively. So it's two different mechanisms, essentially. And the reason I don't have those notes posted on here as bullets about Granular is that we're about to release a new version that will change most of that. So that's another reason why I didn't want to do an installation quick take up front, is that we're about to have a brand new version, so I thought it might be better for a later date. But the core architecture is the same, right? So our backup service stores backup sets to the specified UNC file locations that we designate during initial configuration. And we can manage multiple locations, and we'll look at all that when we get to the live examples. The service account assigned to this backup service is full control policy for all web applications. That means we have access to all the content to backup and restore. He's basically an administrator across the board in a sense, right? We give him access so that he can back up and restore everything he needs to, depending on who's requesting. That's the general role of the backup service. Now, earlier we mentioned a primary backup service, and essentially what this means is there's one single backup service that we've designated as primary, and we give him a service order of 1, and we'll see what that means momentarily. But essentially, one of these guys is designated as the leader, quote unquote, and when new operations are submitted from the management service, this primary backup service is the first guy to get them, and then he delegates amongst his cohorts here in the backup service realm who's going to do what, essentially. So he's delegating backup restore operations to the other services in this installation. From the farm backup scope, what that means is he gets the initial request, and let's say that request was, I want to back up content databases 1 through 5 and also search components from server X. So he receives that initial instruction, understands, okay, well, I know that the content databases are on the SQL server and the search components are on server X, so I'm going to send these instructions to those 2 backup services specifically. And he doesn't necessarily manage one of those particular servers, but he delegates that information. I hope that makes sense. So essentially, he's taking in the initial instruction and delegating it off to the appropriate backup service to do the work. On the Granular side, it's a little bit different because we only ever need one single entry point to the SharePoint APIs to access all content. There really isn't a server-to-server differentiation there. So what he does in that scope is he'll receive the initial instruction, the operation initiation, and by default, he will do the work. He is the one that has access to the SharePoint APIs if and only if he gets multiple instructions for the same time. In other words, if we have scheduled backups that overlap and he's receiving multiple simultaneous operation initiations, he can delegate out to the other SharePoint backup services located on WFEs to handle those as a load balancing concept. So essentially, from the Granular perspective, the primary backup service still serves the same role of delegation, but he only really delegates if he needs to in terms of load balancing. And we can see where that's set up in the console in a little while. Self-service recovery solution is the final bit, and I didn't want to go into too much detail in this quick take because I plan to have an entire quick take just around this in and of itself. But essentially, this component is an optional component. It's a SharePoint side farm solution, a WSP that gets set up in the farm solutions, and it basically just allows site collection administrators the ability to view backup sets from right within site actions. So in their site collection, they can go to site actions, view all the particular backup sets specific to their site collections, and then download those to their file system to be dealt with however they see fit. It's not truly a point-to-point restore. It's more of a, hey, I need a document from something I know is backed up. Let me just jump into site actions, download that document, and then upload it to wherever it needs to be in SharePoint. And then, of course, this requires access to the management service, similar to how the console connects, and those configurations are pretty simply set up on the SharePoint side. Now, again, this is an optional component. It's got its own set of unique things to keep in consideration, and that's why I thought it might be a good subject for a future quick take, so you can expect more from that in later coming weeks. So now I'm going to do a quick rundown within the tool, kind of show some of this stuff in real time, and then I'll just open the floor to questions and we can go from there. So as you can see here, I've got a SharePoint backup console. This is the console. So this is that user interface component. And as you can see, I've got all kinds of information here about servers for farm backup, If I switch over to granular backup, I'll see information about the web apps. I can view specific information if need be about backups that have taken place. Might not be too much done here at this point, but you should get the idea. So there's different places we can look at different things, what's been scheduled, so on and so forth. The real thing that is pertinent to our discussion today, though, is this configuration view. And here we can see a breakdown of what's out there. Now, my installation here is quite simple. I've just got the one server, Spitfire 3, and he hosts all of my SharePoint backup components. And now, obviously, if this was a larger environment, you'd see separated server names with each component and the SharePoint components listed out specifically. And this is just to give you an overhead kind of bird's eye view of your entire installation. Furthermore, in this fault tolerance tab, you can see that I've got Spitfire 3 set up as my primary backup service. This is where I would delegate that role amongst my WFVs, right? So again, one of these backup services, let's say I had 4, one of them would be designated as primary at all times. And he's the one who takes the initial instructions and delegates them out as need be. You'll also notice that there's still some IDEA branding in this installation. And the reason for that is because this installation is specifically set up for particular troubleshooting, and it's good to note that this tool has evolved over time, and it came from a different company. So it's interesting to note what those different naming conventions are. Over here in the SQL Server, I'll show you the repository database. Here, this one's called IDEA, but in the newest version, it's called Metalogix SP Backup Repository. And in their tables, we've got a lot of different tables here, a lot of relational stuff, not all of which is human readable. But the big key players here are the backup services table, which will give us a breakdown of the different backup services and their service order, as you can see in this column. Service order represents that fault tolerance, that load balancing. So in this case, number 1 is obviously our primary. If I had additional, there'd be 2, 3, 4, and so on. We can see information about what port that particular service is listening on. Last time we got a heartbeat from it, and so on and so forth. The host name that we're connecting to, and so on. There's a few different things in here. I mean, I won't go through all of them, but I mean, obviously configuration, specific operations that have occurred, backups and restores. We can see that information here as well. All of this is exposed in the console in human readable format, but just to show you that, yes, I mean, there's several different tables hosting all this information, and we can easily mine this out if the console ever became compromised for whatever reason. Console is essentially a completely optional component in that sense. I mean, once we have things scheduled, management service and backup service will continue to do their job with or without the console. So it's interesting to note. Next up, I want to look at just the services themselves. So again, we're IDEA branded here, but we've got a backup service component, and these are just straight up Windows services, right? And we've got the backup service and management service here. On the file system side, you'll note that we have under program files, we have 2 different directories under program files. In my case, I have 2 different because I'm hosting both a backup service and a management service. But what I'm noting here is that each service has its own program files directory, hosting its own configuration, DLLs, and log files. And in this configuration files, we'll see things like, let me just open this up for you real quick. But this is where we'll see configuration information, such as, where the management service is located, what our timeout values are defaulted to, what level of logging we should set, and so on and so forth. So here you can see some timeout values, the logging values set to debug. Here the ports that we're using, the server name of what's hosting the management service. All of this is configured upon installation of the backup service. but it's it's not uncommon that we might need to refer back to these configuration files just to check and make sure that things are configured correctly. So we can see a lot of information with these configuration files, and there's one for the backup service and as well for the management service. Console also has one, but we very rarely need to access that one. And then otherwise, we've got these service logs, and the service logs just basically write information as operations occur. And we use a tool called TraceRx Viewer to view these log files. And if there's ever problems with an installation or problems with a backup, or you're seeing errors when things happen, that's what we're going to look at, right? Just a little extra info for you. On the SharePoint side, obviously, I don't have it installed here, but obviously in the Farm Solutions section, we would see that self-service recovery component. And again, I'll have a quick take about that by itself at another time, but this is where that solution would be seen, obviously. So that said, I think I'll go ahead and open us up to some questions. I think we're running pretty quick on time anyway. So I see a couple of you out there. I'm not sure if there's any questions, or if not, I mean, we can move to adjourn, but just keep in mind that, I mean, the real main point here is that just understanding that workflow, right? So we start at the management console. We send an instruction to him for a backup, for instance. He sends that instruction on to the management service. Management service provides that off to the primary backup service, who delegates that work to the appropriate backup services, then sends status information about the completion of that job back to management service, who then writes that information in the repository, which is then read to the user from the console. That's really it. So I think that should cover it. We're about at the 5 minutes till mark. Again, if there's no questions, I don't see anything coming in. I'm not sure if that's due to network contingency or because it's just so easy to understand. I hope that's the case. But, oh, looks like we got something. Let's see. Should the backup management service run on a SQL server or app server or WFE? So the quick answer is anyone you want. I mean, it doesn't have any specific requirement, but it can certainly run on any one of those. In my particular installment here that you've seen, I've got everything running on one single SharePoint application server, right? Which also doubles as a WFE. I've got a SQL server on a different server, an instance on a different server that's hosting my repository database. Often what I'll see is that the management service will get installed to, like, let's say if there's a situation wherein a person is managing multiple SharePoint farms that they're backing up, they'll have that management service hosted on an application server in the farm. Like, each farm will have an application server hosting a management service, and then he'll have one separated SQL Server instance hosting all the different repository databases. Because remember, there's a one-to-one correlation between management service and repository. So I hope does that answer your question? I hope so. Anything else? Great. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting and invite you all to send any other follow-up questions you have to the support department if you want. Again, most of what we saw today is included in the documentation that's included with the product when downloaded. I did go off on some tangents that probably won't be specifically handled there, but yeah, feel free to reach out to support if you have other questions, and we'd be happy to get back to you and have discussions offline. Otherwise, you can access this meeting, the recorded version, from the Metalogic website under support, and look out in the future for future discussions regarding additional subjects around the SharePoint backup and diagnostic manager tools. And with that, I will thank you all and have a fantastic day.